Welcome to our first lecture on a series of lectures on markets and the economic concepts of supply and demand. Supply and demand are not only the most famous economic tools, they are probably the most utilized economic tools. Throughout this lecture series, we will explain how and why supply and demand are used to analyze what we call markets. So up here we have our typical supply and demand curve. We have our downward sloping red demand curve, which tells us buyers in a market. So demand, you can think of it as buyers, and supply you can think of as sellers. And it's very important when you study supply and demand to identify what's being measured on which axis. So on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we have price, or the price in the market, and on the horizontal axis we have quantity. And when supply and demand come together, they bring us to what's called market equilibrium. And we will review all of these concepts in detail. We'll actually study demand first, and we'll study that side of the market in detail, and then we'll study supply in detail. But for now, let's talk about the different types of markets which exist. So a market is an institution that brings together buyers and sellers. That's basically what a market is. Now, a market can be face-to-face, it can be local, it can be national, it can be international, it can be completely electric or online. All right, as long as it brings together buyers and sellers. In the beginning of these lectures, we're going to emphasize the idea that there's a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. This is important because we want to study the typical markets before we get into a specific type of market. So the typical market, there's a very large number of buyers and a very large number of sellers. So it's the interactions of these buyers and sellers which will affect the price-quantity relationship, the equilibrium, as we like to say in economics. So the product market, these are goods and services bought by people like you and I. We call this consumer spending, or households. So durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. An example of a durable good would be something like a computer or an iPod. An example of a non-durable good would be something like T-shirts or shampoo or soap. And then of course services would be something like, if you go and you get your nails done, or if you have your hair done, or if you have something quite more expensive like a knee surgery, right? So healthcare services. So that's the product market. The resource market, right? There's 4 economic resources. We only have 3 labeled here, but we have land, capital, labor, and entrepreneur ability, right? So there's a market for these resources, and it'll be interesting because who are the buyers and who are the sellers in the resource market? It might change who are the buyers, but the principles of demanders and suppliers will be the exact same. Finally, we have financial markets. And you're probably familiar with some of these terms. Some of these are a little bit more of a finance concept, but stocks are bought and sold every day, and it's definitely the market forces of supply and demand that determine the quantity bought and sold and the prices. Bonds, which are another financial instrument, right? A way of for companies or countries to sell off part of their debt is what a bond really is. And then one that definitely has economic implications, especially for macro currencies. So what does the dollar trade to the yen? What does the dollar trade to the euro? What does the dollar trade to the Brazilian real? So currencies. So those are our 3 types of markets. Well, even though we typically say supply and demand, we always tend to teach demand first as economists. So let's talk about demand, let's define demand, and let's talk about what we mean by the demand side of the equation. So demand is a schedule of the various amounts of a good or a service, or a resource or a financial instrument. It's the various amounts of an item that buyers are, and this is important, willing and able to purchase at a series of prices for a specified amount of time. And of course it's ceteris paribus, other things being equal. So let's take this definition piece by piece. Well, the various amounts here, we can see on the left hand side we have quantities, right? We have quantities on the right hand side of that table, right? So it's the various amounts of any item that buyers are willing and able to purchase. So we don't want to make assumptions about what people would or could do if they hit the lottery. We want to make sense of markets. So when economists use the term willing and able as part of the definition of demand, what we're saying is if the price is, say, $2 in this market, buyers are willing and able to purchase exactly 55. It doesn't really matter right now what that 55 is, 55 of anything, but and therefore, if the price were $5, buyers are willing and able to purchase 10 of this item. So it's the various amounts of a good or service or a resource or an instrument that buyers are willing and able to purchase a specified amount of time. So when we analyze markets, so for instance, the stock market, a half hour could be a lot of time in the stock market. Depending on the day, there's a lot of volatility. Sometimes nothing goes on for a week or two in the market, but other times there's days where the market moves quite enormously in a short amount of time. As opposed to in different markets, say something like, the market for wheat, right? The market for wheat or for grains, that the time period there might be something like a week or a couple weeks where we're analyzing. But the point here is that in order for us to make sense of markets, we can't just extrapolate indefinitely into the future. We're analyzing a specific time period when we analyze markets. So it's the various amounts of an item that buyers are willing and able to purchase, right? Series of prices, specified amount of time, and then ceteris paribus, other things being equal. So the most important determinant of quantity demanded is the price. And we're going to talk now about the law of demand. So what is the law of demand, right? What is the law of demand? Well, the law of demand is pretty straightforward. It says that as the price of a good or service falls, quantity demanded rises. And as the price of a good or service or resource rises, quantity demanded falls. So what we're saying here is there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. If price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and if price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Now notice I'm taking my time to specifically say quantity demanded. All right, we're not saying demand here. In other words, when price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. When price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Right? So the most important determinant of demand, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, is the price in the market. And this is important because later in the lecture we're gonna differentiate or distinguish the difference between a change in quantity demanded caused by a change in the price in the market and a change in demand caused by something other than price in the market. So why is there this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded? And what is the cause of the law of demand? Well, that will be the beginning of our next lecture, why the law of demand exists, the 4 reasons behind the law of demand.